My name's Terry Golightly. I grew up in the area. Parents moved to the area in 1949, purchased Ben and Mary Steakhouse, and we played baseball here, football here. Brother played ball here in the early 60s. My wife went to Marshall High School, and then the high school burned down. She went to Front Royal. Family's from Winchester, but our grandfather lived in the Plains. Lots of Dotsons and cousins that lived in the Plains. In the early 60s, we had 3 high schools. We didn't have one, and then they consolidated the 3 high schools, which put a lot of good ball players together in one school. The Wines and McGuins, of course, my brother, the Foley boys, lots of good ball players from 3 different schools came together and played very, very good ball. We were playing music 1967, 1968. Back then we had barn parties. You know, they would have clear the hay out of the barns, and you had the perfect dance floor. So we were playing music in a barn party in Marshall. And during one of our breaks, local Glasscock boy, Timmy Glasscock, came up to me and said, "Are you Terry Golightly?" I said, "Yes, I am." And he grabbed me by the shirt, and out the door we went. So we rolled on the ground for a couple seconds, a couple minutes, and we stopped. And then he said, "You're dating a Glasscock, and you're from Warrington, aren't you?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Don't you ever come back here again. Don't you ever come back here and date a Glasscock being from Warrington." So that was my first real induction into Marshall. So they had some pretty good ball games between Marshall and Warrington and Cedar Lee. They were very, very competitive games. It was a very good time, and there were lots of people from Marshall and the Plains and Delaplane. My wife grew up in Delaplane, that would come to Mom and Dad's restaurant, Ben and Mary's Steakhouse. Mrs. Trumbo was a huge favor, a huge person in my mom's life. My mom loved Mrs. Trumbo. And when she got sick, I took care of her for a while, and I would get a list to go to the IGA. And it would be Petridge Farm cookies and whole milk or whipping cream. And she would always say that, "Don't you bring skim milk in this house. I want whole milk, and I want whipping cream and Petridge Farm cookies." So I would visit Mrs. Trumbo, and she would always give me my things that I needed, and I'd take them back to Mom, and it was a really good community. There was a group of people in Marshall in late 80s, 90s, that Mrs. Bates lived across from the Methodist church, and she had a group of children. They were called the Bates Crew, and she had a van, and it was different walks of life, blue collar, white collar, different church groups. We had Presbyterians, we had Baptists, we had Catholic, Episcopalians, Lutheran, and we all got along really well, and our children were safe. So when we would take our children to the preschool that she had there, she would sometimes take them to the pool, which we had the Marshall pool back then, and we had a swim team. And we always felt well with her and our children. Our children got along with everybody else, and her oldest daughter, Erin, and then the younger son, they looked after the children. And their youngest son came to me one day, and he asked me if he could take Mandy out to lunch. So I said, "Yes, you can take Mandy out to lunch." So he and Mandy walked over to, it was Joe's Restaurant now, but before that it was the Barn, I think. And they had lunch and the pizza and the Coca-Cola there. It was really good. But we always trusted Mrs. Bates with our children. And we played baseball together and all the children. And it was a very safe environment for our children. It was a very good community. And we did activities in the community and fundraising in the community, a lot of volunteer work. So that was a very good thing, and we really liked that about this town, about this community, and why we settled here. Her being from Delaplane, and we knew a lot of people that would come over from to the restaurant. Mrs. O'Bannon in the hardware store would come over a lot, and We would go in the hardware store and get things, and then if the hardware store didn't have it, Jake and Mrs. Jones, Betty Jones, had the Western Auto. And you could go into Western Auto and get pretty much what you needed. And there was a picnic table there. And if you had time, usually in the afternoons, Henry Dawson would be there. We would sit down and have a Coke or a cup of coffee, and Mr. Jones usually had a pot of coffee on, and we would talk and tell stories. And Henry knew tons and tons of stories because Henry grew up in Marshall. His whole family grew up in Marshall. His family moved to Warrington in the early 50s. They used to live beside the restaurant. That's where I first met him. So if back then we didn't have phones, we had a pager, so if they needed me and I didn't respond to the page, they would call the Western Auto and see if I was there at the coffee table, sitting down at the picnic table. So that was always a joyful place to be in there. My grandma and granddad lived off of Bunker Hill Road, and I believe my grandfather worked for the DuPonts. He was a chauffeur and a gardener. He always drove extremely fast. He was a very good driver, but he was always fast. And he was a good man. They held Christian meetings in their home to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ. There was always a good place to be, and he taught me how to wash my hands, and he would go slop the hogs, as they called it back then, and that's how I learned to wash my hands when you would come in from there. And then Mr. Baber, who was a police officer, lived right across from the pool and beside Mike and his family. I think his dad lived there also. His dad lived, I think, where Mike grew up. Mr. Baber would tell us stories about people he would pick up in the community that were driving too fast or maybe had a little bit too much to drink or something, and he would take them home. Sometimes if they needed a way to get home, or if you were a younger person, he would take you home, and then you would have to deal with your mom or dad. So he picked me up one night and he took me home. Well, my dad, and we didn't have cell phones, my dad knew before I got home that Mr. Baber had me. That's how the small town works. It's always very interesting, always lots of stories and people in the restaurant. He was a good man. Mr. Baber was a good man. Had a couple children we played with and things like that. Sammy Joe and Mac were their names. They were really good community, good place to grow children, good place to grow up. A lot of good people. My brother played baseball, and when they would come to Marshall, it was always very, very competitive. The Wines boys, Mickey McGuinn, Kelly, anytime that you came to Cedar Lee or Marshall, you had to play really good ball, or if you went to the Plains, they had really good Little League baseball in the Plains. Terry Kennard's mom and dad coached the Little League team, and Mr. Strother coached the baseball team in the Plains, and when you went there, you better be ready to play ball because they were well coached. He was a good coach. He was a good man. And then later on, people would come in the restaurant and they would want to sit down for 15, 20 minutes and have dinner. And they might have a young child, and that child wouldn't be cooperating with their parents wanting to eat for 20 minutes. So one of the greatest things I saw my mom do was my mom would go get that child and put the child on her hip. And then she would wait tables and go around and show everybody the child while the parents could have 20 minutes to eat. And that was always one of the great assets about my parents, was that and the hug. Lots of people can cook steaks, but that hug and things like that was important. It was very important. And the town now has changed a lot. A lot of work on our streets, a lot of communities changed, a lot of people have changed, moved away. They're all still good people. There hasn't changed that about the quality of the people. It's just they're different. The banks are different. A lot of good people in the banks. They help you a lot if you need something or if you have a question. They're really good about that. A lot of history in our area. Mr. Ashby knows probably more history than anybody, and he is very, very good about telling history, and his knowledge of stonework and his knowledge of history, and his ancestors go way back, maybe 1776. I believe his great-grandfather was in the war, general in the war, so a lot of good things come from the town. We've enjoyed it very much. Back in the 60s and the 70s, we had a lot of rivals in sports. Baseball, basketball, football, there were always good games. Mr. Wines, Carlton Wines from Marshall, held the basketball 2-point scoring record. It was only broken recently, and today we have 3-point plays. Back then you only had 2-point plays. And it was always fun to come to Marshall and watch basketball because it was on the stage, and it's right there. There's no room between the stage and the seats. You are right there. But after the games and after the rivalries and everybody got together, when they would come to the restaurant to eat, the rivalries were left on the field. They didn't come along with you. They didn't drag them out. That was always nice. And you're going back and seeing people now, and you talk about the games or you talk about your parents and their parents, and it's always nice to see people at the 7-Eleven or at different places at the store, or the IGA or Joe's or Nick's, and talk to different people that do different things. And the kindness it's really important, the kindness. There was a pack of matches that was found on eBay from New Hampshire. And Regina, that owns the framing store in Marshall, bought them and framed it and gave it to me. That was very, very kind of her, and she had done some other framing for us, and she does an excellent job. One of the things that when people would come in the restaurant is that Mother loved to see the prom night come, because the boys and girls would get all dressed up in their suits and their tux and their dresses, and Mom would always put on her long dress, and she would put her hair in a bun, and she always loved serving the children and seeing the children come in, and, as I call them, children. And she would do special meals for them and special things that they could have, and Cokes and hot dogs or grilled cheese sandwiches or a nice salad or something like that, that they would all enjoy to come into the restaurant. And the Sunday meals, she always loved that. It was always nice living with that and that kind heart. Now our children growing up in Marshall, the children that they grew up with now have children like they do, and they are seeing them at baseball fields and t-ball fields and swim meets and basketball games, and they're able to talk and reminisce. And the Smith boys and Mark Smith, and he has boys that play baseball, and it's nice to see, you know, our daughter and him get together, because they were friends in high school. Because once they consolidated the schools, everybody came together in Warrington. So they were friends before, and then once they went to high school, they helped each other in classes. And Mark got sick when he was a junior or a senior in high school. He got real sick, some virus or something that wouldn't allow him to walk. So Mandy picked up his homework and took it to his house and worked with him. I assumed that's what they were doing. That's what she said they were doing in Orleans, and she would take his homework to him and spend some time with him. That was a really good, kind thing that she did. And it's just continued all through the years, even up to now, where we are to now, 2023. It's all the kindness and the people in the community has always continued to be a good community, people helping everyone. I've enjoyed it very much. It's been very good, very kind. And of course, Dr. Royston is a wonderful, wonderful doctor. Community, he always calls you. He was having some trouble with a patient, and he was on vacation, and He called my wife while he was on vacation to help her. And he's on vacation, so you can't ask much more from that. And the crew that he had, Dr. Hauska and the other doctors, it's important to them that we're healthy. It's very important to them that we're healthy. So we really like that and love that about the community. It's been a very good place to live. Very good place to live.